Your characterization of local food movement as being disappointing and escapist. I'm actually involved at the moment in drafting a manuscript of a book this year that looks at post-consumer possibilities and interrogates the localization movement and comes to more the same.
Oh, yeah?
As a pathway to an alternative future, I think the local food movement is seriously lacking. But I'd ask you to comment a little bit about the dynamic between those that constitute themselves as local food activists and the larger institutional industrial structure that, at least from my perspective, is in many respects kind of conquered from within the local food movement and redeploy localism as a means of using, consumerism to create this kind of false alternative to consumerist lifestyles.
Mm-hmm.
Anything related to, yes?
I think mine is related.
Okay, so let's
I was struck also by the comment that the local food activists don't see themselves as addressing this larger underlying system. And I have the sense, but I'm not sure, that many of the other examples that you talked about also, I didn't see the pathway to scale. In other words, to go from these local kind of ethnographic studies to social change writ large.
Is it also along these lines? Or
Sort of,
should we wait for it?
it's all related.
Let's, I think this is a very complex question, so let's take that and then there will be next round. Paul and
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great about your book. I would very much like to read it more. So it's true that there's a lot of effort to conquer the local food movement or food activism and this idea of, well, sustainable agriculture and so forth. I guess I don't know that invalidates some of the positive effects that I was talking about, because again, I mean, it comes down to this whole question of, if it's not oppositional, does it mean it's sort of worthless? And I mean, I clearly struggled with that. When I first read this paper with Diana, I was really critical. But, I did sort of say, okay, I've got to look at this from a possibility angle, because that's what we're promoting. And so figuring out that it was developing out of this neoliberal context, which is the idea of a perverse confluence, where there are resources out there. There is, in some ways, there's a lot of really bad aspects of neoliberalism, but it has freed up for a lot of experimentation that's going on. So there is a tremendous, like I said, amount of experimentation going on. And I think that that transformation, it's something about people developing a sense that they can organize locally anyway. So it may not be so much about the consumerist aspect, but the ability to organize locally, I think, is important. And I do think that, like Food and Water Watch, I think could do a better job of working with people at the grassroots. So I don't think that every assemblage has to take on everybody. I think there can be a division of labor. So what I would really be interested to see is a regional or national group that can connect And right now, they can't connect because they don't understand how they're organized. You know, and it was, as I was saying, these are organizations that are developed in a neoliberal context. So they're much more like small affinity groups. They don't have constituencies like older social movement groups often have. You know, it's much more like 3 or 4 people at the core kind of developing the farm cafe or supporting food tours or farm tours or something like that. I do think, though, that if they saw a direct threat to their local ability to organize, they would put in energy and effort into it. So, you know, it's not going to, the actual complex assemblage is not going to necessarily scale up, but it is creating a lot of change in subjectivity, which I think could be harnessed. I don't know if harnessed is the right word, but could be mobilized.
So I think you said that the aggregation of all these cultural assemblages, while necessary, may not be sufficient.
Right.
So I hope I would be extrapolating correctly by putting words in your mouth and saying that's because the problem these days is systemic.
Right.
And consequently, it requires a level of response to that challenge that is at the level of complexity
Yes.
of the system that's now failing.
Yeah.
Furthermore, that system that's now failing is playing out on a global field. It's, of course, a very complex assemblage of assemblages across many spaces. But I'd like to hear you talk about, since we've known since Gramsci wrote about it, the community and identity and counter-hegemonic cultural activity is essential to a movement. And now we're talking about anticipating or imagining the formation of some kind of coherent movement that can challenge modernity itself in its late capitalist phase on a global field. Okay, how can we talk about the possibility for identity formation, given that as the challenge?
What if, I'm really happy that we have this opportunity to talk about this because I think about it a lot. And I really think somehow there's got to be a division of labor. And I don't know that there's going to be like a command post somewhere where somebody is figuring all this out. I think it's more different groups sort of doing what I'm talking about, figuring out what the trends are and cultivating positive directions and trying to work in alliance sometimes. The problem with the people who can figure out the master plan is they can't translate it to the local level. They may be able to translate it for policymakers, they may be able to talk governments into putting resources into it or maybe creating laws, but there's still this level where it doesn't compute or it doesn't make sense or they're not emotionally connected to it. So to me, I think the grassroots level is important. As I say, so my idea is much more a division of labor somehow.
Yeah. My question has been made more precise by Paul's in your response, because I would take issue with the idea of a division of labor between the local and the global. I think the weakness of the movement is precisely that division, supposed division, exists. I think the notion that people develop their identity in the context of some kind of culture is well known, and from time immemorial, that's obvious. But the practical issue, and what any sort of theoretical approach would, I hope, help us to achieve, is to talk in specific terms about how people in one given sort of cultural formation might be become receptive to another cultural formation, and everybody at every level needs to be aware of the need for that in order for their project, in order for the global project to expand. It's not enough to have these sort of microcosmic things all in different places. This week we've had it can go on forever and nothing will ever be done. And it's only if they come together in an organizational way, ultimately, which combines the grassroots with the sort of what you call the command post. I don't like the idea of command post because it should be a democratic process and founded in a kind of grassroots understanding and involving grassroots people. So that's the kind of thing that I would be looking for. And I guess what I would ask would be how the theoretical apparatus you have would help us to understand specific cases where there's been this kind of process of, well, like in the case of environmental racism, where you open up to the environmental issue people whose primary initial cultural orientation is toward the oppression defined in racial terms, and expand that to a larger compass.
And try to formulate your question.
Victor.
That one thing I liked about Pete is dealing with the perception that environmentalism is a movement for wealthy white people.
Oh, yeah.
And one thing that mass production, industrialized, globalized, fossil fuel agriculture has given is a lot of cheap food.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to eat locally and seasonally. I found out it's very expensive. And so, given an expensive local organic food movement and stagnant wages, especially for people of color, how do you scale up when organic agriculture can never compete on price terms with mass-produced agriculture?
Maybe you can take them.
Sequentially?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll start out with Victor. So, like you say, well, we've known this about cultural identity and so forth for a long time. This idea of cultural assemblages, these complex cultural assemblages, is not like our old notion of culture. And so I think that is an important contribution of this idea. It's a much more kind of modest notion, and it's sort of associated with these communities of practice. It's something that can be performed in a local group of some kind. And to me, this is a much more nimble concept. It's much more useful for talking about activism because these kind of cultural worlds form on the margins oftentimes, like environmental justice formed in the margins, and almost any of these kind of systems, I mean, they develop in different ways and become widespread and less widespread, but I think this is a much more useful concept for us in thinking about activism especially. Let's see, your point, I mean, you're basically saying, well, you know, what you've really got to figure out are what the connections between grassroots activism and these other parts are. And I agree with you that that's an important problem. You saw in the becoming an environmental justice activist, there have been efforts. It may be that the efforts to bring things together and to scale up has to be done through a kind of cultivation, which I was talking about. So, I mean, there's been efforts to bring together environmental justice and mainstream environmentalism. That's one way. There's a great example of a movement that's trying to bring together these different complaints and different problems in North Carolina with the Moral Mondays movement, if you've heard about that. The people trying to work with that, they specifically talk about a fusion movement. And they're, trying to develop practices and so forth to do that. So, I mean, to me, you've got activists at all different levels. And I just don't think there's a magic way to do that. I think there has to be work. I mean, you can teach everybody the great 5 principles of life, and then everybody will work together. I don't think that's right. I mean, I think that there has to be activists out there at different levels who are working to create these kinds of alliances and structures that we need. So that's my proclivity. Oh, wait, did I get to yours? Oh, yeah, the expensive food. Well, that's one reason why I think that there really needs to be another group of people, another level of activism that is fighting for these more local systems, because everybody knows, not everybody, that the subsidies, that the way they're provided now, make local food much more expensive than it needs to be. In other words, if the subsidies were shifted, what you're talking about wouldn't be as big a problem. So.
It's a question here.
So, just to the problem of identity here.
Uh-huh.
Now, if people want to behave in a certain way,
Yeah.
so one of two ways: either I behave and then I believe, or I believe it so I behave, right? So maybe this local movement, grass movement, wants to have people behave first, and then have this idea elevated into a belief system that will carry it through to the upper, maybe. Because I have been involved in a social justice study in Boston, and I have interviewed a lot of the activists, and they we don't want to talk about politics. It even bothers us. We're only doing. This is what we're interested in. So maybe then it's another level that we need evolution to reach.
Yeah, I mean, that's another reason for focusing on this level of communities of practices. A lot of these are learning communities. They do develop. They're not just, repeating the same things over and over again. They do develop, and they're learning. And so, in the local food movement, as I say, they talk about environmental sustainability and so forth, but they don't always try to apply it or get better at applying it or so forth. So, there are pushes that come in different ways, and what they're working on. I think one reason that they are in this very much of a building phase, I mean, it's a very constructive and creative kind of movement. And a lot of it I trace back to this neoliberal, this perverse confluence, because you can get some resources to build new things, and it's exciting to build new things. So right now it's in a phase of creating things, and then at some point there'll be an encounter with limits, and then the reaction then is going to be what's important. So.
Yeah. I think the local food activism is a very interesting example, and I think it exhibits some of the characteristics of the environmental justice that you discussed in the chapter that you gave us to read, and I've seen similar things elsewhere. What happens is that people think that a movement is about one thing, and then upon inspection it turns out to be about very different things. And so in the chapter you gave us, you delineated in a very useful way those differences. So you talked about the environmental justice activists saying it's about the quality of the water that we drink.
Oh,
and saying the environmentalists thought it was the quality of the water that they sail their boats on.
yeah.
We could give many more examples, and just the immense gap that creates. And I think the same thing is true in local food. There's a lot of rhetoric, but when you pierce that rhetoric, some people are interested in getting much higher quality food in frameworks that might have been amusing to Marie Antoinette. A lot of CSAs, you see people in the Range Rovers pulled up in front of the farm where they come out and pick 6 blueberries and call it a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not about sustainable production of food. So, people are really about different things, but they don't think about it. They all think they're in it together. They all think they're about the same set of issues. And so I think one of the useful things in this work is to tease those things apart. Julie Shore's contribution to Alice's work did the same thing. She pointed out that people who don't bake the right kind of goods are not welcome at food sharing events. Muffins are not wanted, truffles are wanted.
Yeah.
And so I think what I'm saying is that part of what this kind of research does is to tease apart those things and make it clear where those fissures are. And if we're ever to have a local agriculture that does anything for the majority of the population, we first have to understand why the current agriculture doesn't and can't. And then we can go on to consider what might.
I'm very sympathetic to what you're doing. I think that there are solutions here, and that should be taken into consideration when I say something which is a little bit critical. The notion that you've got these groups that have social relations and values which are not compatible with capitalism, and they're kind of nibbling away at the domain of the capitalist system, and they may weaken it more, they may weaken it less. And that's one way of looking at it. It's not what has happened in my experience, which is that this is a dynamic situation of adjustment whereby capitalist and political forces find ways to recognize, make money off of, and exploit these oppositional movements. And I've been very active in global warming around Boston for a long time. And what happens is that there's a constituency around global warming. So the powers that be get together and say, let's develop an industrial policy where Massachusetts becomes a world leader on green technologies. And we are going to make lots of government money available to these groups, because we know that the voting, there's a large voting constituency which is green, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. So we can, in certain cases, this is a corrupt system of diversion of public money to private greed, but it's facilitated by the environmental movement. So these forces, the environmental movement, the business interests, and the political power structure, have found ways to adapt to this. And who is the winner depends upon expertise, power, and the ability to play the game right. In terms of environmentalism, a lot of people, there are winners and losers, but certainly the capitalist class is not a loser here. They have moved ahead. So I just want to kind of inject that complexity of interactive systems. Anything that happens with green environmental stimulates something which is green money, that these go back and forth.
Yeah.
Is it connected to this? I think
In a way, yes. It is a different dimension, yes.
Okay, so let's wait. You would like to add to this?
Yeah, I just want to
Yes,
say,
and then
Yeah.
what I think, Dottie's done here is to develop, a cultural sense of what goes on in organizing sentiments in these contexts that she's talking about, and I think it's always going to be, that's critical, because we do work through these. I'm also in North Carolina, and we're right now dealing with an issue of power. And it's a problem we have, I don't know if you know this, but North Carolina is one of the leaders in renewable energy. We have more new installations in the last 4 or 5 years. I think we're third in the nation. And it's because we have a tax credit for, especially for solar. Well, you also probably know about the takeover of the state government by very right-wing Republicans who want this to lapse because one of the most powerful utilities in the country is Duke Energy down there, and they've long been an advocate of coal and petroleum, and so they're going to allow. They just announced their governor wants this tax credit to last because we don't need to subsidize them anymore. They're too successful. Right. Well, we've just, in a way, we probably have solarized less than 2% of all the rooftops in North Carolina. We're just getting started. So here's the question, and to me, it's about power relations, but it's also a figure. And to me, it's complicated in that we are constructing meaning right now around. Do we all of us groups? I'm from the mountains. And we got the Piedmont, and we got the coastal areas, and everything in between of the various organizations dealing with solar, right? Can we form coalitions when we know that if we help that other organization, they might get the next funding from Fred Standback, the largest environmental donor in the U.S., right? Or we won't get it. And we're in this thing about, it's not only just meeting, but it's struggle for resources. And I'm talking about now, how do we scale up, right? And so to me, it's an interaction between power and meaning, obviously. And so maybe you could talk to that, Dottie.
And respond to Fred's.
And John's too. John. Yeah. So let's see.
And Fred. Yeah.
And Fred. Fred. That's Fred. Okay. So back to John talking about what different movements actually mean and so forth. One thing I realized I didn't say about environmental justice, that did scale up in a way because that Dolly Burwell, who we talk about in the article, went to South Africa, was invited to South Africa, and environmental justice got written into the Constitution of South Africa, the new Constitution. But anyway, I didn't mean to get off on that. What I wanted to say was that this business about what is the focus of a particular group. Well, so this research that we did, a lot of research of this type sort of focuses on one group and looks at it and figures out what its meaning system is and so forth. We started out with a kind of inventory in each of these 4 places that we went to. And what we saw was interaction between these different groups. So they're not isolated from each other. And there's kind of a dialogic going on among them. So in Charlotte, for example, the slow food movement was chided by some of the food justice people because they said, oh, you're just food elites and you don't care about these other people. And so the slow food movement reacted to that and set up a community garden and these things they call friendship trays and so forth. So there's an interaction that goes on in the shaping. I think our study was good for that reason because you can see the kind of dynamics that's going on in this field of movements. Going back to, Fred and what you were saying, obviously Gibbs and Graham have gotten a lot of the kind of critiques that you're making, that it's, not paying attention to these powerful structures and so forth that are there. And that's definitely a problem. And the fact that there's a lot of activism within capitalism where they see these possibilities to exploit. There's a constant kind of rolling and development that's going on. And I don't know, I mean, maybe that would cause you to say, okay, when we're assessing which of these kind of grassroots groups to support, maybe we should look for ones that are particularly kind of against that kind of co-optation or something. I mean, you know, which kind of groups you support is what is open for grabs, and there may be some that are going more in the direction that you think would stop or prevent this kind of easy rip-off of the ideas from the capitalist groups. Jeff's point, let's see, about power relations. I mean, again, that's what I was saying, that I think your group is running into one of these limits of that's imposed by these structures, and how they, I don't know how they'll react to it, or what they'll do about it, or who they will go into alliance with. But I see what you mean.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to this metaphor you had of an iceberg that you
Yeah.
said in the beginning,
Okay.
where what's underwater is so much bigger than what's above the water.
Yeah.
I suppose you meant it to show it that way.
Uh-huh.
So there are all these activities. Okay, let me step back for a moment. For me, when I think about some kind of transition to beyond the consumerist society,
Yeah.
I see it definitely as an issue of politics, power, economics, and we talked about that.
Uh-huh.
It's also of culture.
Uh-huh.
And I think that one can actually think about it as a cultural phenomenon, not totally separate from the other ones, but certainly give it its own thinking. So, so you're talking about all these myriad of activities here, right? And each of them is creating these cultural assemblages that create certain identities. Right? Is there? So I see a potential power in it, even in some new cultural framing of well-being that is not connected perhaps with consumerism, or some other reframing. Can you comment on that? Is there any precedent? Do we understand enough about the interactions of such different assemblages and communities of practice that could create some bigger framing of who we are and what well-being means?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by bigger framing.
Shared framing.
A shared framing. Well, I'm thinking that there are cultural assemblages, communities of practice, that do try to elevate different notions of life. I mean, the sustainable happiness, people are trying to do that. The voluntary simplicity people tried to do that. You know, like the Kondo book, the tidying up, you know, the magic art of tidying up. You could see that is a sort of an alternative framing.
And I wasn't thinking of specifically activities that focus on simplicity and lack of consumption, but less consumption, but various economic new forms of ownership and so on, and food movement and so on. Movements that are not necessarily connected with consumption, but where lifestyle, different visions of living well are an essential part of them. Can they, do you see of them forming something out of these individual parts?
So you see that as a larger kind of focus. I mean, in terms of, are there groups that are trying to do that? There are people who are advocating for groups that are often displaced by the growing kind of neoliberal regime that's going around the world. And so I have a colleague, Arturo Escobar, who talks a lot about what he calls relational ontology. And so he identifies a lot of the remaining indigenous groups and some of the Afro-descendant groups that are in areas like Colombia, who've kind of been there for a long time and have developed. He thinks of it as an ontology, and so he sees there's sort of a war going on between the kind of ontology that's pushed by the West, which is very modernist, and sees culture and nature as separate, versus these ontological, relativism sort of ontologies. And so he would probably say, well, they've developed a master frame which integrates a lot of the kind of thing that you're talking about.
Can I follow up on this?
Yes, and then another Rich has been waiting. So if you are following up, and then Rich.
Because I'm struggling with the same question as Helena, but I would like to go back to the remark that Paul made earlier about that the issues are systemic, right? And systemic issues require systemic answers. And I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with a grassroots activist that many of you know actually, who told me the story that many of these groups start out with a systemic vision, and then during their actionism, they have to narrow themselves of the vision that they are narrowing on, and they lose their system. So that's exactly the wrong way around, you would say. So basically, I think my question is, does the cultural perspective actually offer the possibility of transcultural frame, macro frame, as Helena was talking about, across all these, I call it subcultures. I'm from the 60s, right? And so one of my frustrations is that we have been grappling with these things for about 50 years now. And in my view, we didn't make a lot of progress. So now we have a somewhat different language. But we have not really figured out how to, is this a systemic change that is taking advantage of the cracks in the system, as Eric Holland right, or is it this Escobar much more of a confrontational issue?
It is much more what?
Much more a confrontational issue.
Confrontational.
It's a question of power and counter-power. And so my real question is, does the cultural perspective creates the perspective of a more cohesive macro frame of bring all these groups together and of transformation?
Okay, so let's also ask.
Yeah, in fact, I'm glad we went back to the iceberg image because I wanted to focus on the very top. And the systemic implications of the top, wage labor, products for a market, right? We're in a capitalist economy. People need their income, right? This also gets to the issue of affordable or unaffordable, sustainable food products. So it seems to me that Philip is right, and several people are sort of right, that a lot of groups lose their systemic focus trying to be successful within at least some narrow frame. But it seems to me again, and perhaps you're familiar with this in North Carolina, you can't have a successful local food movement or a sustainable food movement without talking about sustainable labor that goes to produce the food and work on the farm. So I haven't really heard of this movement linking with the farm workers movement or similar movements to get livable wages for farm work, but it seems to me, again, one of those components of the systemic view that's essential. And to me, what it implies, since farm workers, we know, are extremely underpaid compared to what they deserve, or anyone deserves, it will imply that food will have to be much more expensive, no matter what, in the future than it is now, sustainable labor and sustainable agriculture. And therefore, it may actually help the overconsumption problem in other areas because people will put more of their income into into their food and less and have less available for other things. So there may be indirect good effects too. But I didn't want to stress that as much as just the need to link up with labor, because a lot of the elements below your iceberg line, below the water, right, imply almost like giving free labor to the production of food locally, and most poor people can't afford the time even to put free labor in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of similarity in these issues that we're discussing. The thing about coming up with a systemic kind of response, I mean, I think what I was trying to suggest was that, again, going back to this division of labor idea, I mean, who does the work of the systemic response fall to? I think that's a question. I mean, what I've been involved in is thinking about, well, how can we cultivate directions at the grassroots level that we think are positive? That means that we've got to be able to assess what's positive. That means that we've got to, you know, also have a lot of conversations coming from a lot of the problems that you all are bringing up about the limits. How do you get by these limits? And so forth. So I guess what I think we need to ask is, okay, if we're gonna, you know, if we took the role of trying to support or cultivate certain directions, how are we gonna do this other systemic work? I mean, I think we have to take a role and a responsibility in this. I think that's another piece of this Gibson-Graham approach. You know, you don't stand back and say, you know, I'm the analyst and I can draw up a blueprint for this. You have to become more active. And so I would turn the question back, who is going to do this design work?
Yeah, I think the place to start
Yeah.
is to not polarize it between, you know, cultural assemblages working on specific issues. On the other side, we have command posts and blueprints.
Okay.
So let's get rid of that.
Okay,
That's
I'll
all
try.
thinking,
I'll
right?
try.
That's the central committee.
Okay.
So,
All right.
So I think the answer is in the historical challenge. We can't create that level of unity.
That's right.
The crisis can create it, and only the crisis.
Uh-huh.
And the reason the crisis can create it is because people interested in 1,000 different issues can't succeed unless they find ways of being synergistic with one another in the context of an overall framework. That's also, I think, the objective basis, Victor, for why it needs to be democratic. So there's a third way besides the top-down blueprint.
Okay.
And that third way is because all these different dimensions of the problem need to discover each other, not just because it's a good idea, but because it's the law. No, because it's the law of history, in the sense that if they can't succeed without forming higher order alliances, okay, then at least that's on the agenda. You know, to explore those higher order alliances, because there shouldn't be a contradiction between good food, justice, climate change, and the whole rest of it, because it's a systemic problem, and all those issues and crises are manifestations of a single problem, the problem of the crisis of the system. And so that's the basis for finding that higher order way of being active at catalyzing unity and cohesion across issues.
I would like to ask if anybody would like to build on Paul's comment. On Paul's comment, because we are short of time. Okay?
In Juan Martinez Ali, he was a Spaniard, actually, he's Catalan. He's written a lot on environmental justice. When he was asked about alternatives, he had just said that the alternatives will emerge from the resistance. And so I think it's really important when working with lots of groups to keep a common theme of resistance.
Maury?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm struck the last couple of days as we reach the moment where Hillary Clinton ultimately announces her candidacy, is that there was a great deal of hopefulness 6-7 years ago, that the incoming administration at the time in Washington, given that it received substantial support from activists involved in a number of these areas under the waterline, would provide validation and create institutional forms for their advancement. And we obviously haven't seen that. And that we now sort of see that same hopefulness now emerging again. And I'm fairly confident that those expectations will be dashed, because Hillary Clinton ultimately will not be the reformer that many people would want her to be. So I come back to sort of Paul's question of this almost a certain sort of hopeful sense of historical inevitability seems to get frustrated at each time we reach the gate, at least in the American experience.
I'll not say inevitability, just possibility.
Well, I just observed that what many others have, and that is those who are most beneficiaries of the system are the best organized to defend it and promote it. The classic case 45 years ago, you're all familiar, so-called Powell Report, assembled in the quiet of a few rooms and a few $2 billion, put in place a whole infrastructure for protecting, if you will, the status quo, at least in the U.S. This is not a global thing, although, of course, it has global implications. And they did a masterful job, and 45 years later, you know, the modern conservative movement in this country, the Tea Party, might reasonably say is an offspring of such movement, is still well entrenched, well in place, and resists any form of systemic change which they have very cleverly defined and hold in place.
We need to end the formal part of it, so I would like to leave the last words. I think that's maybe on a more positive note.
Well, so you know, we're struggling with how to this systemic answer and these alliances, and I guess, you know, trying to apply what I've said to that problem, I would look around for, okay, what movements are doing that? I mean, I think the activism I've been talking about happens at different levels and among different people. It happens sometimes with policymakers. It happens sometimes in the corporate world. Going back to the grassroots, as I mentioned, I mean, I think Moral Monday, they're doing a lot with the fusion movement and what to do. I'm also reminded, I have a graduate student who's been working in Mexico on the anti-GMO movement there. And so they're developing, they have an organization that meets something like once a month. And this is farmers and people who support farmers in Mexico City, or I don't know where all they meet, but anyway. So there's like this conference that is a continuing discussion about how to deal with problems like what you're talking about, Jeff. And so they rotate through people from the smaller groups that are out in the hinterland. So you get this like constant dialogue that's going on. I mean, there are people out there experimenting with these in a more, and this is the democratic angle that you're talking about. There's lots of experimentation going on. So to me, the question is, how do we support it? How do we support that?
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, I've enjoyed this. Thank you. Thank you.